Good evening, everyone. I'm Barbara Corcoran, Vice President of Education at the New York Botanical Garden, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our first lecture in the portfolio series with our speaker, Tom Balsley. My sincere gratitude goes to the Humboldt Foundation for its generous support of the series again this year. Thank you, Monica. And a very special thank you to Susan Cohen, NYBG's Landscape Design Program Coordinator, who has shaped and guided this beloved series since its inception 22 years ago. Before I introduce our speaker, a few quick notes. To enable live captions in English, click the closed captions CC button, then click Show Subtitles. Also, at any time during the presentation, please feel welcome to type questions by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your window. Our education manager, Jason Griffith, will raise these for our speaker to answer at the end. So tonight, we are very proud to have Tom Balsley with us. Tom is a principal of the New York City-based studio SWA Balsley and has been practicing as a landscape architect and urban designer for over 35 years. Very early in his career, Tom anchored himself to New York City, and throughout his life has remained very committed to our public spaces and to the human condition. It is astounding to contemplate his imprint on over 100 parks and plazas across this city, from Hunters Point South to Riverside Park South, Chelsea Waterside Park, Rockefeller Plaza, Gantry Plaza, Capitol Plaza, 51 Astor Place, and not incidentally, a small park on 57th Street that was named Balsley Park in recognition of his enormous design contributions to New York City. He has transformed hundreds of acres of degraded landscapes into healthy and splendid parks. And even underground, the MTA selected his bench design for its subway system. Tom's impact has extended, of course, well beyond New York, across the country and the globe, most recently Paveletskaya Park in Moscow and Nelson Mandela Park in Rotterdam. He is the recipient of dozens of national and local design awards, including the ASLA National Design Medal and 2 ASLA National Honor Awards for Hunters Point South Park, a model for resilient waterfronts, which you will be hearing more about shortly. Tom is deeply committed to environmentally responsible design. He has made significant contributions to the profession of landscape architecture itself, publishing nationally and internationally, and teaching frequently, including at Harvard's Graduate School of Design, the University of Pennsylvania, and Seoul National University. We are indeed privileged to have Tom Balsley with us this evening. We'll be back at the end to take your questions. And now, please take it away, Tom.
Thank you, Barbara. What a wonderful introduction. I want to thank you and Susan and for the invitation, and Jason and Ivy for the help I've been getting today to pull off this. We're in the remote land, and it's a very difficult transition from in-person lectures and talks like we're all used to this. So we're going to try to make this interesting for you. So what I thought I would do is pull together a few projects that really cover a range of scale and types, but there's a reason I selected them, and that is that we all have this sort of a first impression, especially the lay people have a first impression of what sustainability is, and the first thing they think of is environmental sustainability or ecological sustainability. But what if you really look at the book and ask what the mission statements of sustainability might be from one organization to another, it includes cultural sustainability, community sustainability, social sustainability, and we often focus on that facet of the sustainability challenge that we're all embarking upon. And I wanted to share some of the smaller social spaces that deal with the cultural and the social sustainability challenges, as well as the environmental and ecological. So we're going to start with some small little privately owned public spaces called POPs in New York City. And then we're going to finish up with Hunters Point South. And right maybe in the middle of all this, we're going to give you an actual fly-through video of Hunters Point South to give you a better sense of the scale and the character of the space. So let's go right to the first slide. And it's the cover slide. And as Barbara noted, we do proudly, or I do proudly hold the ASLA National Design Medal. It's quite an honor to be one of only 15 who are holding it. So I put it on display very nearby as I work, and I'm inspired. And then there have been 2 monographs published of my work. The first one with a foreword by the New York Times architecture critic Herbert Mouchamp, who is no longer with us, and a more recent one that you can find at the MoMA bookstore with a foreword by James Corner, who I'm sure all of you know. I've had many exposures and profiles published on my behalf, but the one I'm very proud of is the one in Landscape Architecture magazine that took particular note and focus on the work that I do with respect to social spaces and people-centric design. And you'll see that as we move through some of the projects I show you, that they're very people-centric projects. Most of our projects don't even have a photograph without a person in them, and that's very different than some other designers who are very interested in presenting the craft and the art of their work. I'm much more interested in how many people I see in the benches. So along those lines, if you really think of New York, you may or may not have heard of this expression, POPs, that really stands for privately owned public open spaces. And these are these small little spaces that are built by private developers who are building a building, a tower. And if they pull that tower back from the street and create a public space, a privately owned public space, and they do it at their expense and they maintain it at their expense, they get a slight bonus and a few more floors on top of the building, additional FAR it's called. And this is a program that New York City has had going since the late 60s. It's called incentive zoning. The interesting thing about this, and it's produced a lot of really bad spaces and a sort of a bad deal for the public, if you will, but it's created 95 acres of publicly accessible open space within the densest part of Manhattan. You'll see some of the dots there. Those are just those that we've done. But there are over 300 of these little spaces scattered around Manhattan. So they really have the potential to touch the daily lives of millions of people. We're very proud of the program, but quite honestly, we sort of got involved with the program in the early 70s. But before that, there were these abuses. And I think you can see these are privately owned public spaces that have virtually no public value at all. But over time, the rules changed, they tightened up the rules. And as we started to design them, we could actually begin to see the potential. So here's the one that Barbara made mention of, one we did a number of years ago. This was a POP up in the upper left-hand corner. You'll see this was a privately owned public open space, but it was really occupied mostly by pigeons. And it had no value to the neighborhood. In fact, it was kind of pulling the neighborhood down. And so we actually were able to transform this failed space into what you see on the screen. These wonderful green spaces for this neighborhood that have completely transformed the character of the neighborhood and it really has touched their lives. And there are examples of those kinds of plazas all throughout the city. These are just a little eye candy of a few examples of them. but they've had an enormous impact on our lives here in the city. And those that have failed have a chance to be turned around, as I demonstrated with the previous slide. So the city has the opportunity to take 95 acres and, if it's failing, actually turn it into a success like you're seeing here. This is a one little pop I wanted to bring to your attention, only because when I first came to New York in about 1973, I sat on this corner, the corner of 3rd Avenue and 8th Street. And if you know anything about the 70s in New York, this was the cultural crossroads of the city. It was the sort of the gateway into the East Village, which was chaos and more. And then there was the genteel village. And it was a wonderful corner to kind of study people and see the way they were acting and misbehaving. It was just extraordinary. It's better than a Broadway show. Now, as I sat there as a landscape architect, I said, you know, this corner really needs a plaza. It needs a public space. And of course, then I went on with my career. And then about 8 years ago, I got a phone call, and the client asked me if I wanted to design a plaza on the corner of 8th Street and 3rd Avenue. And I almost fell out of my chair. I thought, I think I already have it designed in my mind. And so I went on to design it, this little space that you see here that's always occupied day and night. And it really still is that cultural crossroads of the village and of this part of the city. And actually it was the design was inspired by a little space I saw in San Francisco, a similar space that was lined up on, that was abutting Market Street, in which they had just lined a bunch of park benches, one after the other, almost like church pews. And it was one of the most successful spaces in downtown San Francisco, because it really demonstrated to me as a designer that we don't really have to be too heavy-handed to be able to touch people the way they want to steer them in the direction they want to be in a kind of an urban setting. What they want to do in most cases is they actually want to see other people. People love watching other people. And so we lined these benches up in a way that they could be watching other people, but then we faced them toward each other, so there could be some fostering of that cross conversation as well. A very successful space in the city. Now, we about 3 years ago, I merged with SWA, who is the largest landscape architecture firm in the US. And one of the first things I did was begin to sound the alarm that it was almost 40 years since the famous Holly White book came out about the social life of urban spaces. This was a very important book for all of us who were in this business, if you will, who were studying urban design and studying small urban spaces, architects, urban designers, landscape architects. Holly White was legendary. And his book was almost a manual. I taught it in my first class at Harvard, and I insisted that the students see his video. It was that important to all of us at the time. But his work was based upon his observations as a sociologist of New York City and public spaces in the 1970s. But what we've witnessed is an extraordinary change in this city, a change in which we can have movable chairs. That would be unheard of in those days. Or furniture that swivels and shifts around. You know, these wonderful garden spaces with small little public personalized spaces. All of that was kind of unheard of in the 70s. In fact, I had clients tell me that I was free to design the plaza any way I wanted to design it, as long as I didn't put a bench in it. It was really that kind of a background in the 70s. So we thought all of Holly's observations, we should renew them, refresh them, take a look and see what we can do, and how can technology help that as well. So excuse me, I'm going to go back. What we did with Emily and Anya, they got together and they created this new manual that is going to be a manual that is the precursor to what we hope will be the next document similar to Holly's that we can put out and make available to everyone. And it took into account about 10 spaces in the city, Of course, they went about the measuring of its success and its occupancy and the behavior of people within the space, and they did it in a very traditional way through observation. But they also brought in a technology called this automated heat map, which can actually map people and introduce and bring that data into programs, and they can develop a database that can be useful as they're designing this space or other spaces as they move forward. And we hope that that will be incorporated into this new book that we put out. But the beginnings of it can be found in this field guide that we've put out. One of the things that comes out of designing these small public spaces is you begin to understand through the eyes of a sociologist how important public seating can be. It's not just about a bench anymore. It's really, we're living in a different culture of recreation. If you think about how the benches are arranged in Madison Square Park, well, they're all arranged in a row because people used to kind of promenade in their top hats and nod to each other. And that was what going to the park was all about, being seen and saying hello. Well, we're not quite that way anymore. We're much more informal the way in which we interact with one another, and sort of what we call the 21st century of 21st century of recreation is a much more relaxed kind of a lifestyle. And so we want furniture that fosters that and accommodates that. So this is just one example of a park in Cleveland that we designed, where we experimented with, we wanted some lounge chairs. We wanted them to be comfortable with a nice sloping back, wide enough for two people to sit on them. Not just a conventional bench, but then we started thinking, what else can we do? What else can we introduce to this space that will make it feel much more like home? And as we talked, we realized that thing, that object that makes us feel like home is that coffee table in our family room. Why can't we have something like that in an outdoor space? So we introduced this very simple rectangular table. And you can just see from the sketches of what we proposed and what has actually happened is, yes, you can actually sit on the table and get real close to someone in that bench and have a very intimate conversation that way, face to face. Or you could actually serve tea or coffee. Or you could just simply put your feet up and relax, have lunch, and watch people walking by. So the table isn't just a table. It's so many things to so many people at any given moment, and whatever the needs may be as they come into the park. And we just think this is one example of how important public furniture should be in our public spaces of the future, because it really is a reflection of our lives and what we really expect from our public spaces. And these are just some examples of some of the furniture that we've been designing in the small little plazas, as well as introducing those designs into public waterfronts and larger open parks. Now here's an example of just sort of moving from the small pop to larger central parks in cities. We were selected by the city of Dallas to design their first new downtown park. It's called Main Street Garden Park. And Dallas, they just hadn't set aside any real downtown park space. So they actually had to buy an entire city block and tear down the buildings in order to build this new park, which is a pretty expensive venture. But they did that, and we created what is now Main Street Garden Park, which is the central focus of a whole neighborhood of retail, business, and new emerging downtown residential developments. And it's been designed to really accommodate large open space, a large open space that's flexible enough that it can accommodate virtually anything that they may plan for themselves, whether it's movies or the Christmas celebration, or maybe the sports team is going to be there, or an orchestra or a band. But we've designed it in a way along the edges so that people can actually find their own personal spaces and yet still have good sight lines, good visibility, into the activity and the goings on in the park itself. And so you'll see these little green shelters. We call them study shelters because the University of Texas moved their law school down across the park when they found out there was going to be a park downtown. And so the park has not only generated this kind of social activity, but it's actually generated commercial and retail activity and development activity around it, as we know most open spaces do. And so here you'll see there's a little cafe and a lot of shelter because Dallas is pretty hot. And we've got misters that come out of the upper columns of the shelter that cools the air in this particular cafe. And then we have a sort of just a river bottom kind of a water feature with white marble slabs in the middle of the river. So you can sit in the middle of the river and take your shoes off and cool off in those hot summer days in Dallas and have lunch on one of those tables. So there's all those other opportunities for public life to just explode. And of course, the nighttime is the part that we've focused very highly on in terms of extending the hours of enjoyment and usefulness of these spaces. They shouldn't just go dark. The lighting should be an attraction for activity to continue through and into the night. Now that work has attracted clients in other places around the world, in China and Japan and Korea. I thought I'd just show you this one project very quickly that we're now, it's actually now under construction in Moscow, in downtown Moscow in front of its major rail station called the Paveletskaya station. You can see that on the upper left-hand slide. Here's their major train station, and this is a large front area that was just a parking lot before, and the city committed that into turn it into a large public park and to create entrances to retail spaces below. So these are all of the studies that we conducted prior to creating this new image for this park. This was an international design competition that we won together with a firm called 5+ out of Los Angeles. And you'll see that it's going to transform not only the foreground of the train station and all the activity that we get with the train station, but also it's going to transform the neighborhood around it. It will have, it's sort of quite honestly, we look to Bryant Park and its programming as a model for what we could program into this space as well. And so of course it will have the retail entrances, it'll have pavilions, but it'll also have markets and ice skating or the ice rinks throughout the winter. And again, you'll see here, the lighting is a very important component to keeping this space active and vibrant throughout the evening. Now, the work we've been doing with waterfronts attracted attention from the officials and the government agencies in Rotterdam. And so we were called into Rotterdam to see if we would conduct a design competition or participate in a design competition for this neighborhood in Rotterdam that has been surrounded pretty much by sort of the underprivileged, the immigrants who've come to Rotterdam, and there's a very strong immigrant population. But it's just, you can see just from the area around this park site, this new park site, there are very few open spaces compared to the amount of green space in other neighborhoods. So there was a real challenge for the city to create new viable park space for this neighborhood, and there was a shortage of land. But what they didn't have was a shortage of these great harbors that they carved and that were really, the city was built on these great harbors for shipping, but that shipping has long gone or partially gone. So the city made a very dramatic decision to actually fill in the inner part of the harbor and actually create new park space for the neighborhood. We were fascinated by that and participated in the design competition. And I'm happy to say that not only did we win the competition, but the city has raised money to build this park, and it has been renamed the Nelson Mandela Park. So we're very excited to be participating in this park, and it's along the water's edge of the harbor. So we're going to be able to develop a whole series of tidal marshes and get downs. There'll be a water taxi that will be part of the whole water taxi system of the city. And then there'll be large open spaces for events and more forested areas for people who want to get away a little bit deeper into nature. This is the site, as you can see, filled into the inner portion of that large harbor, and you can just get a sense of scale of the space. It's pretty extraordinary. And this is not some remote park. This is right on their main metro, the Maashaven stop. So this park is right here in the city and going to be right there at the fingertips of this neighborhood that you see just to the south. Of course, we went through a whole series of dialogue with the neighborhood, with the city, with the stakeholders, all of it leading to what would be a program for the park in a general direction to refine those design ideas. Of course, a very careful site analysis of all these conditions of the edge and transit, et cetera. And that all led to this master plan for the park. And there still will, you wonder what is in this water in the basin itself. These are barges that are parked here. This is basically a parking lot for barges. It's no longer taking in ships for loading and unloading. It's just simply barges that are being parked. So there's actually a possibility as they find more parking spaces for barges, they can actually enlarge this park and get more and more land for even more program. These are just some of the breakdown of the program for the inner park spaces, the circulation, the sight lines, the amount of green space that we're converting and adding to the neighborhood. All of this is part of the development of this park to make sure that it's really going to resonate with the community. And just an image of if you wanted to climb some of the topography, get a larger view of the park and out the harbor. These opportunities are have been brought to the design by bringing additional dredging, fill, and creating topo with that dredging. Just a few other images down at the lower levels, the tidal basin of the park, and then from the basin looking back with the neighborhoods beyond. Now, jumping back to the US, this is an important project for Portland, Oregon. This is called South Waterfront Greenway. And this was a completely contaminated shipping lumber site, part of what built Portland into what it was, but it had been long left to just degrade and eventually slowly erode into the Willamette River. The Willamette River actually rises up almost 30 feet. So the elevation you see of the park versus the river is explained by that extraordinary change in water levels between spring and summer. This is the site, and you can see it was just an industrial site. They made barges and ships, and they used to take the Liberty ships and break them down, and they'd bring them up into these boat ramps, and they'd work on the ships, and then they'd relaunch new ones here. There's a lot of maritime history here that we felt should be uncovered. Of course, it was uncovered through contamination, but we felt it should be uncovered and revealed and celebrated as part of the new design for the Greenway and the park. So you can see the extent of the Greenway, and of course with it comes all the new development that is paying for it and watching over it and maintaining it. And it's a continuous walkway and bikeway, but then there's a whole series of community spaces and overlooks that interrupt that experience. just one peek of a piece of the Greenway, as you might expect. It's so large that it is happening in phases, and I'm showing you the first phase, but this really does give you a sense of how impactful it is for the existing residents, the upland residents, as well as the new residents. And introducing public art into this experience as well, some of it making reference to the industrial heritage, and some of the forms of the overlooks also taking their cues from ship hulls and Corten steel and heavy industrial materials. So we jump back home, and this is what we promised you was we're going to show you two waterfront parks. First, Riverside Park South, and then we'll go over to Long Island City and we'll show you the Gantry Plaza State Park as well as Hunters Point South. Riverside Park South is a very complex undertaking. We actually did the master plan in 1991, and the master plan called for this highway to be lowered to the ground and threaded through what would be new tunnels back here. You see the mouth of the tunnel back in here. And as that money was being raised, which would require federal and state money, we moved forward with the waterfront portion of the park, and we're still stalled on the financing for that. So we're moving forward for the upland portion of the park as well. But what it's done for the west side is extraordinary. It will be even better when the park is threaded through that tunnel. But west siders at this point have almost begun to accept the highway as it is, because they have now access to a river they never really had access to. So they're just threading their way down to this park, and just it's theirs now, and it's theirs in a very different kind of a way than maybe a Battery Park City with a bulkheaded shoreline. It has rich narrative of the railroad activity that took place here, and was a place for many on the west side to work. So we've made sure that the railroad history is being told in all the landscape narratives. This is just to give you an idea of the planning. Here's the park with a highway in place, and then here is the park with a highway threaded, what would be through that tunnel. And now the whole west side, under this condition, will be able to just move down the streets, down through the park and to their river. And this gives you the cross sections that show you how that's working. The first phase that you see now, the tunnels are installed. There's a little bit of an upper park here, and then all of this is built. More of this is being built as well. But in the future, as that highway is brought through here, more fill will be brought in, and it'll be one large park just cascading down to the Hudson. This is what the site looked like before, and this is how we've transformed it into this high marsh walkway, and these overlooks that have a little bit of a industrial character to them, and bridges that cross coves that have their heritage, and then landforms and tall willow trees that have already matured well, and overlooks along the edge. All of this just attracts the West Siders to this place in a way that just a simple walkway along the water's edge never could have. Here you'll see the cove and the walkway, and more walkways to the marsh, and an overlook. It's all this wonderful combination of these elements that bring a rich experience to West Siders as they come down each day, each week. There's a new section to explore, including this pier that was once just a barge pier that goes 900 feet out into the Hudson River. We've converted it into this wonderful recreation fishing pier. And this is just a glimpse of some of the activity. No matter when you go to the Riverside Park South, you'll see this kind of activity breaking out. There's a cafe that gives samba lessons, and of course, I can't explain what some of these are, but they all break out, and you just can't miss them when you visit the park. So we're going to take a trip now to the East River, to a vision that started in 1993. It was called Queens West. It was started up here at the Annabelle Basin, and it included this entire piece of property all the way down to Newtown Creek. It started with a master plan called Queens West, and then the first phase of it was Gantry Plaza State Park, which is this park here. And this park won every national and international award. It really established a new paradigm of waterfront parks by celebrating the history and the culture of the place, and also environmentally repairing the edges of the river, and doing it all in a very contemporary, progressive way with very contemporary design gestures. This is the site. It's early beginnings. It was actually a marsh as part of the river when the river was much wider and not as fast. And then, of course, it got filled in, and it turned into industrial warehouses and barges, and the railroad came down to the site. And then it just laid fallow like this for years and years and years, until we discovered it and transformed it into Gantry Plaza State Park. It was even featured in the BBC Around the World in 80 Gardens, a wonderful little documentary that's been shown many times. And the airline people would take a flight and say, I saw the Gantry Plaza State Park in that movie in the airlines. And I thought that was an interesting idea of what a garden was, but Monty Don seemed to think that Gantry Plaza is a garden the same as any other garden around the world. It's its own post-industrial garden. This is just a view from the park looking up towards Hunters Point South, which is our last featured park in the talk. And just a peek of a few of some of the wonderful gestures within Gantry Plaza State Park, how we've transformed what was this gantry into this wonderful tower and a bridge and a wonderful plaza and a setting, and a wonderful setting for people to gather in very close proximity, or in large crowds, be it I don't know, this might be the longest yoga room in the world, I'm not sure, but this is the huge crowd gathering before the fireworks that you see here. And then this was Gantry Plaza when it was visited by Sandy, the storm, and almost completely underwater, which was a good cue for us as we were about to approach Hunters Point South, because we understood, even when we were doing Gantry, we understood it had to be rugged and would withstand those kinds of storms and flooding, but we hadn't yet fully understood how big of a problem that might have been until Sandy came to visit and we saw what Sandy could do. And so we approached this Hunters Point South with a much greater appreciation and respect for the flooding issues that we would have, the kind of resiliency we wanted to bring to the existing community of Long Island City, as well as the new residents of what will be 7,500 new affordable housing units in this portion of the Hunters Point South development. So we began to look at the park and the park design through a somewhat somewhat different lens, one that went beyond just recreation. It went into resiliency, it went into social resiliency, cultural resiliency, and spread throughout. Oh, excuse me. I've just been reminded that there's a little video. We're going to get a quick fly through. I forgot it. And this is to give you a sense of, just if you haven't had a chance to visit Hunters Point South Park, this, we hope, will tease you out there. before it gets too cold. And here you can see the tidal marsh, the native grasses, the little blue stem slopes. All of this is a conversion of what was once contaminated landfill out on this site, and it's been converted into this Eden. We even carved behind one of the hills, carved it down, and created what is now New York City's newest island. Here you see with the marsh behind it. And now we'll take you on a very quick tour of the park itself. We'll start with the idea that, or the reminder that this was a huge landfill created by the excavation of the Midtown Tunnel. And it just sat there, in some cases, 30 feet higher than the normal ground. So we looked at it and we thought, you know, Queens is pretty flat. This is an extraordinary opportunity for us to really take advantage of views from a different perspective. And so we really focused a lot on the views and the views of the city. Well, you can't get away from them when you're over here on this shoreline. But when you get up in elevation, it's an even stronger, compelling design idea. And this is just an image of us sort of walking up on top of the hill, but also being very, very aware of the kind of the resiliency that had to be taken into account with the design, as well as the heritage of the railroad and the transfer of boxcars out to rail barges. And all of that heritage was a very big part of the approach to the design in telling that story. This is just some of the studies we were doing about the rising tides, the 2 meter, 1 meter, 2 meters, 3 meters, as well as the birds, the flyway that moves right up the East River and right over this site. All of this led us to this conclusion that we really felt we needed to actually create a new tidal marsh along the edge of this park to protect this community, but also to create a new habitat that had long been lost. And so this is just some of our doodling. And you can actually see the forms of this park in the forms of this doodling. So it's very interesting how early on we have these ideas that actually have legs, as they say, and carry right to the final completion. And it wasn't an easy endeavor. It was built over the Queens Midtown Tunnel, over these electric transmission lines, utility lines, very, very complex site, which is why we worked with Arup. This is a collaborative design effort between SWA Balsley and Weissman Frady, but with very strong leadership, engineering leadership and infrastructure leadership from Arup. And they were needed, as you can see, to help us with the infrastructure that's just below the surface of these wonderful landscape experiences. So here we go. We have a peek of the overall park. This was the first phase. It was completed. We were fortunate to win an ASLA design medal honor award for the first phase. And then we won the same honor award for the second phase a couple of years ago. Second phase is more dedicated to the resiliency, to marshland, to promontories and forests. And the first phase is more given to service to the community with very active green, active play areas, a much more social kind of a space that can really serve the community in ways that it said that it needed. And it was very interesting. Not only did we get voices asking for a play area or a dog run, you can see how popular this space is with the community on any given night. But the community was also very vocal about wanting to have a very quiet, passive space, wanting to have a resilient kind of a space that was very sustainable, that they could point to with pride and participate in. And so it was a wonderful combination of the very active node that you see here, and the more passive area of the second phase. This gives you just a little peek of the dog run, and we have a rail garden here. It's paying homage to the rail lines that used to come right down to this site, and the play area, a little urban beach for the neighborhood children. Here's the dog run, and just little overlooks that really give you an opportunity. Just a small group of people, 1 or 2 people, can find their own space anywhere within this park. Or they can go to the center of the park and they can participate. They can, we've got a high school across the street, so they are very active out in the park. But if you come out on the weekend, you'll see people just lounging around, or next thing you know, there might be a Bernie Sanders rally out here. It's been designed to accommodate all of that. All along its length, we have a bioswale, which is taking all the drainage from the boulevard. It's cleaning it and it's sending it back into our ground as it should, and ultimately back into the river. So that's a continuous ribbon of environmental water filtration along the entire length of the park, and we actually pass across it into what we call these park foyers, where people can sit and sort of meet their neighbors and not go much further into the park. This is a peek of the interpretive rail garden with its grasses, but the rails as a constant reminder of the activity that was once here. And this wonderful pavilion that provides shelter for anyone coming down to the pier, but also for those waiting for the water taxi. And the pier is a place that just explodes with activity and events. This is the silent disco, just as an example, but these are people out on the pier and there's no event here. They're just here keeping their eyes on the river, on each other, and the city beyond. This gives you a peek of that bioswale that runs the entire length along with the bike path. And then just beyond, you'll see this wonderful overlook that we've created, taking advantage of the elevation of those landfills that I described. So this was the peak of the park with the first phase completed, and this is what the rest of the park looked like before we made that change. And these are big fills. This is almost 30 feet above the water's level, and this one was about 25 or 20 feet above. Here you see a whole strategy for water filtration, for bioswales, stormwater conveyance, down to the marsh itself, and then filtering through, and then of course the habitat that comes with that, and then the various 100-year flood, 10-year flood, and the mean high water flood tide. You can see the kind of condition where we've taken into account those various storms and those various floods, but we still have a functional kind of a park beyond those buffer areas. This is the creation of what we call New York's newest island, where we actually carved water behind that landfill and let loose this piece of land into New York's newest island. And here you can see it was once a tilt barge or a tilt bridge for barges, and now it's this wonderful new urban island. And of course, we have this wonderful public art piece by Nobi, who captured the whole idea of the tides and the impact they have on the site. And so she captured the 7 stages of the moon in various stages with a luminescent paint. And as it goes dark, it glows in those 7 stages. It's a wonderful piece of art that attracts people to it. The island is a special place. And this is the transformation of the larger landfill into this huge civic overlook that cantilevers over the marsh below. You can see just in this section, that's the overlook, and this is the marsh, and then this is the remnants of that large landfill that was created from the excavation for the tunnel. we thought in order to create a marsh, it needs protection. So the engineers told us what the bare minimum protection was, which was kind of a very engineered kind of a abutment or revetment rather along the edge of the river for waves and storms, etc. Otherwise, the marsh really wouldn't be able to survive or thrive. And so we decided, well, why don't we just make that revetment a little wider and turn it into this wonderful trail along the edge so that you can get closer to the river and sort of be trapped between the marsh and the river and the city. And it's a wonderful experience walking along that trail. It really takes you to, as you can see, really, it's otherworldly. You can't even imagine that you're that close to the city. And as the tides come in, that marsh begins to fill with water and it takes on a whole new character. And then finally, as we go up to the highest point, we have this wonderful cantilevered overlook. We think it's the best place in New York City to have your wedding photos, but it has attracted every kind of activity you can imagine. People are just drawn to the edge, as you would expect, to take in the city. And of course, lighting, as I mentioned in the other spaces that we've designed, we consider lighting to be a very important component. Your life in the city shouldn't stop when the sun goes down. We really want it to continue and take on a different kind of dimension that it does when you have this kind of lighting that you have available to you. So people in Long Island City, the community, will come down here after dinner and occupy the park all the way into the wee hours of the evening. This is kind of a before and after image of, this is that landfill before, and this is how we've shaped it and sculpted it into what we call the promontory. And down at the bottom, we have the lower trail that comes out into these overlooks. And then it rises up into this very high promontory where you can get up here and really take a view downriver as well as across to that extraordinary skyline. And get the sunsets from these are family rafts that we've kind of embedded in that promontory, and people sit there and they'll occupy it, and then we'll get the summer solstice sunsets coming through between the buildings, which attracts a whole throng of photographers. And then what a wonderful experience to walk through the little blue stem grasses up the trail, up the slope with the whole city in a misty fog. We're very proud of this park. Thank you for your patience.
Okay, Tom, we still got just a few more minutes. Can you hear me okay?
Sure.
Oh, so let's go to a few questions from the audience here. We'll start out with something quick. Susan asks, what's the typical time frame for these projects from concept to completion?
Well, there's no typical. When you think about, for example, Queens West started in 1993 as a master plan vision. And we just finished the last phase of it in the form of Hunters Point South Park that you just saw just 3 years ago. Can we call that typical? I don't think it's typical. You can go other places in the world and they build a lot faster, but that's been my experience. These very large, especially large waterfront parks, just take an awful lot of time for the most part. Just like Riverside Park South is driven by real estate. So it gets built as the real estate market goes. And likewise, Queens West was kind of moving at that same pace as the real estate and the development would begin to pick up again. There'd be a need to build another phase of Queens West. So I'm not sure either one of them is typical. But a typical, just a waterfront park, if we had a property and we started today and we had to go through the DEP approvals, et cetera, it might only take 3 years. So there's a big range there, you can see.
Excellent. A lot of questions about your waterfront work here. So looks like an anonymous attendee asked, do you have any go-to or favorite plants that you use to deal with the environmental stresses of these contaminated boggy areas that you tend to be building in?
Well, when we're designing for them, the contamination has been, they've been remediated.
Mm.
So we're left to what we usually go to is what we think might have been growing there when we got there 300 years ago or 400 years ago, whenever that might have been. We think that that's a good place to start when choosing plant material, and especially in Hunters Point South has no conservancy. Well, it has a conservancy. I want to give them credit. They're wonderful, but it doesn't have a conservancy that a real estate driven conservancy like a Highline, et cetera. So it's really a New York City park. That's a New York City park, and it's maintained by New York City. And in that there are certain limitations. So we thought we really had to go to very native, rugged materials that might have been there originally and can withstand the salt air and withstand the flooding, withstand periods of drought. And that's what you see there. You'll see little bluestem on the slopes. You see Spartina down in the marsh. You see a rich array of kind of marshland plants, but they're all native. They're all what you would have seen 400 years ago.
We have time for one or two more. Let's do a topical one here. Another anonymous attendee wanted to know, has the pandemic caused you to rethink how you design for public outdoor space?
Of course, yes. But I'm proud to say, and you could take a project like Hunters Point South. I'm proud to say that our goal when we're designing the space is to make sure there's an open space. It's flexible, so it can just turn into anything a community wants it to be. We feel a responsibility to give them that kind of multi-purpose, flexible space, and at the same time, we create a whole hierarchy of spaces from smaller groups to small little personalized spaces. That's a very important part of our design before the pandemic. We just think that's good design. And it just so happens, we did a test with Hunters Point South, and we went around trying to find all the kinds of places where people could find their little personal space that wouldn't require painting a circle on a lawn 6 feet away from the next circle. And we found they're all through the park. It's just part of, it's sort of the DNA that is in us as we're designing public space.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Tom. I think that's taking us kind of right to the end. And I'll hand it back over to Barbara.
Great.
Tom, thank you. Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I enjoyed going back to Astor Park in the late 70s and starting with you on that journey. The public.
Be careful! Be careful! You're giving away too much.
Those little public tables were genius, and I sat in that park in Dallas. Did not know it was your design, but loved it.
Oh, great!
But really, the real gem here was Hunters Point South Park. Your video was just terrific, from those little doodles to the final designs, to of course all the pictures of people using the park. Isn't that what we really designed for? Is for the public. So what a journey! Thank you so much. There were many questions, everybody. We will send them to Tom. Maybe he'll have time to answer them. I thank the audience so much for your participation, for being here. Can't see you, but I feel your presence. Look forward to the next two portfolios. I hope you will join us for Gina Ford on October 19th, and then for Walter Hood on October 29th. Thanks again, everybody.
And thank you again, Barbara, for the invitation. It was wonderful. And you will see me for Gina and Walter.
Terrific. Thanks so much. Good night, everybody.
Well.